I think my army buddy Riccardo sensed that I was conflicted about my religious convictions. He knew I was a virgin, but he could smell desperate horniness emanating from my pores, and he wanted to bring me to the dark side. He created scenarios to test my devotion to being the pure and chaste woman I thought I was supposed to be. Sometimes I would pass these tests, and other times I would fail miserably. I couldn't help it. I loved Jesus, but I also loved dirty jokes, especially about sex. The more lewd, the better. As our friendship grew, I became more accustomed to Riccardo's perversion. He took it to a whole new level, though, when we carpooled together to visit friends in North Carolina. While driving, he whipped his cock out and started stroking it. I screamed in shock, but I was also mildly amused. Up until this point, despite giving my boyfriend handjobs, I had never seen anyone masturbate before. This new experience was fascinating, but I knew Jesus wouldn't approve. Perhaps Riccardo could tell that I wasn't 100% serious when I asked him to put his penis away, or maybe his sex drive overtook his judgment. He was, after all, driving on the interstate, and since men aren't the best multitaskers, I wasn't sure if he could handle simultaneous driving and masturbating. I vacillated between acting disgusted and also sneaking glimpses, intrigued. As Riccardo got closer to finishing, he reached for a hand towel. I always keep a towel right here for this. So you do this regularly, I asked. All the time, my dear. As Riccardo creamed into the towel, I noticed that his penis was bigger than my boyfriend's. It also had a purplish hue. I wondered if all Hispanics had penises this color. You know where I want to take you, my dear? Riccardo asked after he cleaned up and put himself away. Where? You know those advertisements on the highway for Cafe Risque? Yeah, I replied, laughing. My boyfriend and I make fun of them all the time. They're hysterical. I want to take you into one, Riccardo said. Are you crazy? I asked, unable to contain my laughter. I didn't want Riccardo to think that laughing meant agreeing with his plan, but at the same time, I thought venturing into Cafe Risque would be hilarious. Maybe Jesus would forgive just this one transgression. So we altered our route and made the detour, and I was completely giddy with excitement. We walked up to the building, and a bouncer directed us into a side entrance and asked for our driver's licenses. When I handed mine over, I wondered if he thought I was a dirty whore. We entered through a sex toy shop. I had never seen a sex toy before, and I had no idea there were hundreds of varieties. As I started perusing the merchandise, I caught a glimpse of one of the dancers off in the distance. This was the first time I had ever laid eyes on a naked stripper before. Hell, it was the first time I had ever seen a stripper, period. She was swaying next to a pole on the stage. Right below her was an elderly gentleman nibbling away on a club sandwich. He seemed to be paying more attention to the sandwich than her performance, and I wondered if her close proximity to his dinner increased the risk of him finding pubic hair in his food. I felt sorry for the stripper since the old guy was her only client, and the scenery reminded me of a pimped-out Denny's. After staring for several minutes, satisfying my curiosity, and then realizing that the billboards were totally guilty of false advertising, Riccardo called my attention to the sex toys. I went through stacks and stacks of devices, reading the packaging and learning about all of the ways that they can bring pleasure. I paused at something that looked like a brown strand of oversized pearls. I don't get it, I told Riccardo. Those are anal beads, he offered. What do they do? You put them up your butt and you pull them out. Why? To feel pleasure. You feel pleasure in your butt? Yes, a lot of people do. And it's not just for women. Gay men like them too. Wow, I had no idea. My dear, there is so much to teach you. So now we're going to fast forward back to Kuwait, back to the crazy tent that we lived in with 65 of our closest coworkers. In Kuwait, someone typically turned the sleeping tent's lights off at approximately 10:30 p.m. each night. While most of us nestled into our sleeping bags, hoping to drift off to sleep and temporarily forget our deployment misery, Riccardo chose to celebrate his predicament. And he wanted to make sure I didn't miss the party. Hey! I heard soft whispers requesting my attention. The first time this happened, I ignorantly turned to Riccardo and asked what he wanted. Look, he said, holding open his sleeping bag. When my eyes adjusted to the darkness, I could see him showing off his erection. Stop, I said, not wanting to encourage him or have one of our coworkers catch me staring at his boner. "You did this to me, baby," Riccardo explained. "Put that away and go to sleep," I demanded as softly as possible, hoping no one could hear me. Within seconds, I heard a repetitive whooshing sound, Riccardo's hand moving back and forth against his nylon sleeping bag. I pretended to sleep for the next 2.5 minutes. "All finished," Riccardo announced. "Shh! Check this out." I refused to budge. "If you don't look over here right now, I'm going to get loud," Riccardo threatened. "Fine, what is it?" "Look," Riccardo exclaimed as he pulled a soiled sock out from his sleeping bag. "Ew! Gross! You are so bad!" "Good night, my love," Riccardo replied as he threw the sock on the floor between our cots. "Good night." This continued on an almost nightly basis until we left our camp to launch the Iraq invasion. Shortly after living on top of each other 24/7, bodily functions, especially masturbation, began to dominate most of the conversations I witnessed in Kuwait. "I usually go rub one out in the porta potties," was a common explanation I'd hear from my male colleagues. Now, back at West Point, many guys talked about what they jacked off to the night before. It was then that I learned the importance of this daily, sometimes 2 or 3 times daily routine. But I completely forgot about it preparing for the war, and I assumed that other things, not to mention a lack of privacy, would take precedence over self-pleasure. Wrong. Well, hopefully taking the time to rub one out would allow these warriors to better focus on not getting us killed in combat. And I guess I was okay with them needing to do this in my presence as long as it guaranteed my safe return home. Prior to the deployment, I certainly had a healthy sexual appetite, even if I was working hard to suppress it until the church deemed it holy for me to finally spread my legs. But all of this talk about General Order Number 1 and not giving in to our most fundamental desires actually made for a more sexually charged environment. So by the time we were ready to move into Iraq, I couldn't stop thinking about sex.